himself within and part of that collective whole. The process of consolidation is the collective creation of town through house improvement and infrastructure development, which involves several stages from the house to the street to the neighborhood and eventually the city. Town is made of the addition of shops, diversity of tenure, supported by infrastructure, water, sanitation, electricity, which in turn signals an advent of civic decorum. Already at the early levels of consolidation achieved during this project in Savda Gevra, the political voice at the scale of the town, which in turn is an increment of the city scale. So consolidation of a settlement into a participating increment of the host city is not purely a bottom-up process. It's not a simple aggregate of improved individual dwellings to which institutions are attached, but rather city and settlement growing together. And again, this makes me think about Asher Gertner's work and his discussion of tenure diversity, and how he talks about how legal and illegal are not the only categories or predominant categories through which people are living in cities. In fact, we have all kind of legitimate ways in which people live in cities. You have customary tenure, minority rights mediated through political representation, various tribunals, legal pluralism. And the argument he makes is that this kind of multiplicity of tenure is what keeps these spaces from being out of the property market, and in fact enables low-income neighborhoods to exist in the city. So there is an investment in keeping something not quite capitalized, not quite part of the market, so that capital can't enter, so that speculators can't enter. But in Savda Gevra, they have entered. Land value has risen drastically in the catchment area of the sewage project, even for those plots that are not even connected. Many of the original residents who formed the operation and maintenance team and the RWA have since cashed in, sold their plots, and moved back into slums in the inner city. This push and pull of gentrification has made the community very vulnerable, and again raises critical concerns about when infrastructure should be put into practice. Infrastructure driving development. I've talked about the idea of consolidation as a claim for permanence, and I now want to explain this through ideas of sedimentation and accretion, to use material metaphors to explain what's going on. This visual shows the incremental process of consolidation, represented as a spectrum of stages of the growth of homes. The principal conclusion I suggest here is that there is a potential limit for effective use of resident-led incremental methods of additions and small improvements in facilitating civil collective change. I suggest that there is a sweet spot where sharing and incrementalism can be most effective to drive infrastructure improvements. I use the word sharing because collective, a now well-versed antidote to neoliberalism, is too loaded for me. I'm more interested in very primordial relationships and negotiations. Oh, at one end of the spectrum, we have shack-like dwellings, and at the other end, we have contractor-led improvements. And the middle, dominated by single-story sound structures, is the ideal stage for sharing and incrementalism. This middle or sweet spot fostered a condition where the commitment to a common good overrode individualized behaviors. The collective, those families which had already built individual household septic tanks perceived the benefit of collective action and were the first families to sign up. Here I want to bring Stephen Graham's work into the frame. He suggests that urban infrastructure, which has long been overlooked by social theorists because of their largely normalized and hence invisible quality, is only revealed during moments of breakdown. Graham thus suggests maintenance and distribution is a means by which to explore the technologies, assemblages, and politics that produce and shore up everyday life in the city. In more developed contexts, infrastructure becomes normalized and hardly worth thinking about, thus losing its productive capacity, until it does. And I think Flint, Massachusetts is a case in point. The point is that the sweet spot is where civil society has the means to produce community infrastructures, but not the middle class priorities and values that transcend them. But if the sweet spot is part of a continuum, then how do we reconcile the politics of shit with the capacity to aspire? Or alternatively, what are ways that we can imagine being in the city that doesn't have bourgeois citizenship as its final outcome or final subject? Infrastructure is engagement and participation. I can't spell. When we finished construction, 77 households were connected, and today, of the 322 in the catchment area, only 150 have connected. And yes, more are doing so, but this is indeed a slow process. However, I have often argued that this speed is critical for the ability of the less powerful residents to engage with and build the world, their world. Unlike rural settings that tend to have a slower pace of change, urban settings tend to have a much more dynamic land markets and citizen flow and interaction. In this, infrastructure and people can arrive quickly as per the market and policy conditions. This can create new temporalities that can be in conflict with the slow and high social investment processes that are required by community-led planning and maintenance. And also, because of the close quarters of the site, these infrastructures can foster jealousies with adjacent unserviced sites. Last year, one of the neighboring residents vandalized the project. So this also brings out questions about how the infrastructure operates within a larger urban system, all of which are issues that have come to the forefront of this project in the last 2 years since completion, and it's a point of departure for new work. And so for my concluding segment, I just want to raise a series of questions rather than resolved ideas. Do these infrastructures and formalizing of property benefit the most vulnerable populations, or do they potentially kickstart a gentrification process which further marginalizes those intended beneficiaries? And an even more critical question is, does this kind of incremental infrastructure relieve pressure on the state? Does it let them off the hook at best, or at worst produce legitimate internal urban infrastructures for second-class citizens? There should also be room to critique the practice of community participation-led infrastructure. The material motivation is undoubtedly noble, or so I've been told, to provide basic infrastructure to peripheral marginalized spaces, but it raises a few questions in regards to this project. Is the scheme's operation sustainable beyond its hand-holding stage? If you remove Cure, who still have to be there, what then? It's almost undisputed that communities benefit from an involvement in the design process, but do they have the institutional capacity to sustain that maintenance process? Maintenance requires technical expertise, but also social brokering skills, which most members of the community simply do not have the time to build without a corresponding income. The sunk costs of infrastructure are high, and they require further sunken social costs to sustain themselves in community-led contexts. Thinking via the practitioner's lens, pragmatically, one has to approach the intervention as a temporary incision. The highest degree of involvement is in the design of the infrastructure, which in itself locks the conditions and processes of maintenance. So from a practitioner's perspective, can infrastructure be designed to be just good enough so as not to displace the local population? And then, do my actors have a way of defining incremental infrastructure themselves? Do they conceptualize it or resist it? In these debates, I often find a sort of silence about those who these processes are being designed for. And I think I'm gonna end there. These are just some of the many questions that I'm grappling with as I continue my work as a sewer socialist.
Thank you very much, Julia. And now I'd like to invite Owen to join us on stage. I've just ejected it. So do you want to put that on maybe on there? Yeah. Okay. So Owen Hodgkinson.
Hi, hello everyone. Yeah, I just have to say, yeah, I'm not kind of in the same camp as the intellectual conceptualizing, overriding things which will, solve all these issues. And yeah, thank everyone for that, because it kind of gives me the ground to just talk about lived experience and the things I've done. And I think while I talk, maybe, all these questions that have been coming up can maybe be thought about in the terms of, why Civic University is looking towards classrooms, practices in space, and how they can be supported, why they're important. So yeah, why do I talk about lessons from the community garden? I've been running a space in Deptford called the Old Tide Mill Garden for the last 4 to 5 years. And we've always kind of gone at it with the intent to make a really valuable community asset permanent. It was there before us, and we hope it'll kind of remain after we're gone, and it's taken up as a space for civil society to engage in the long term. So there are conflicts, complexities, and the need for cooperation to make this work. And yeah, I'll try that in terms, I'm going to steal from Frank's talk in saying that for me, conflict is about that, access to land and who has the rights over using it and actualizing it. In complexity, I mean that kind of, impeachable capital and expenditure and the profit motive for the built environment to occur without maybe being of benefit to the community it seeks to displace. And lastly, in cooperation, who are the disparate communities who actually end up organising together to defend and resist these spaces. So this is the site in Deptford. And yes, where's the conflict here? This is all part of the kind of Deptford Town Centre regeneration project. And previous phases saw, the building of new housing next to a new school, amenities like libraries, extensions to leisure centre. But what you kind of don't see here is that the deficit infrastructure often places on councils is the means to just perpetuate that development. And on our site here, there will be another 200 homes, which actually in its building destroys a really mature garden. It knocks down social housing and actually displaces the community which exists. So the conflict isn't new. In our case, we're actually fighting the garden as we speak. There's a campaign to try and save it, keep the social housing, and I'll talk about later these disparate communities who've come together to organise. But in the first phase, this is the Tidemore Academy. So it's actually one of the first academy schools in London. It was heavily opposed at the time by parents and teachers just because of its private nature, its business-like structure, its lack of transparency with the community. And what they saw was a loss of a really embedded school, a place of education, and that worked outside of just school hours and teaching. So this is kind of the things that start to arise. And this is what we're dealing with today. So this is the development proposal for the site. It's actually a housing association who've put together this proposal. And I'm kind of going to try and paint a picture of why it's so difficult for groups like ourselves to engage with and influence the outcomes, because the precursor to us having to fight over space is that this happens over such long lengths of time. So here what you see is nice new homes, lots of lovely verdant green space, and kind of public arenas. This it kind of looks like a nice neighbourhood. But what it doesn't show you is that there is very little in the way of affordable housing. Some of the housing is marketed as luxury, and it kind of is pushed far out of the kind of aspirational attainment for a lot of Deptford residents. It also it kind of takes public space and packages it into some kind of gated space, pushes pocket parks onto people who really don't want them, and leaves you just with kind of thoroughfares. It's quite sterile, and this is what we're fighting over. This is kind of a huge loss of what we see as a vital asset right in the heart of a otherwise quite deprived community with little to no green space, which is increasingly diminishing. The social housing on site also is demolished in the process. But it's not all doom and gloom, and I want to kind of talk today about how we've reached the point where we're fighting toe-to-toe with developers, and there's aspirational alternatives being put forward, often from that kind of voluntary capacity to do something different in the community, but with a smattering of experts who can kind of come out and help show these proposals to work, so that you just don't have this one dominant narrative of the developer's way, the expert is the only way. And yeah, I would like to say on the flip side, the narrative is kind of heavily laid towards that of the developer's vision. After getting kind of a deferral on this whole planning application, which in and of itself is a huge win, the landscaping team in the kind of developers team get to just like articulate more seductive images of what this future space can be. In all intents and purposes, they look great, but when you're on the kind of the cosh, you're receiving regurgitated views of what you're really trying to defend. You see outdoor classrooms and art scene, music festivals, playgrounds, and you realise this just can't happen in the spaces they propose, which is why we find ourselves really stuck with a conflict. And I think this kind of space takes the biscuit. You know, this is 300 square meters of what is now just like dog shit ridden lawn on the side of a heavily polluted roundabout in Deptford. And you would never want to put an outdoor classroom there unless you wanted your kids to like die in early death or be run over in the process just trying to get to this public space. So, you know, we're really fighting a hard battle here. So what is it exactly we're fighting for? So this is the Old Tidemore Garden in Deptford, and like I say, we've been opening that up to the wider public for the last 4 years. It was actually developed by the school into a nature garden and had been there for 20 years prior to, you know, provide outdoor education for kids. So we've just tried to build on that ethos, and I think this image really sums it up. You know, this is like not predetermined, flexible space where kids and adults alike they can literally build and change the environment around them. They can take risks, they can play, have fun, and socialise. And I think it's a really important starting point for where we leap from the aspirations to organise around more complex structural changes for the communities that need it most. So other projects, I've run the wildlife gym for the last 3 years, where kind of older people who are isolated can interact with the rest of their community, cook and garden together to improve their physical and mental health. We also do citizen science projects. So this is Garden Lab, where we've been looking at not just the kind of flora, fauna, the biodiversity of the site, but how these spaces make us feel and how we treat them socially and emotionally. And we've tried to record that in really kind of expansive ways. To using this space for fetes and festivals, where lots of local talents get to showcase what they do, from music, dance, theatre. And yeah, they don't compare really when you start to look at what developers often propositionally put forward and try to sell to a community through that kind of one-sided consultation process. And yeah, so this is kind of the thing we're up against. We were given meantime use. You know, this was like interim use of the space, and we knew from day one that actually we were going to forego that agreement and fight for something permanent. But what on the other side is the kind of status quo here. This is the Deptford project, which is just a stone's throw away. I think Frank in his talk kind of picked up what's the infrastructure around the middle of Deptford, and this project was funded by Cathedral, a housing developer, from the start. And for 6 years, they kind of, you know, invested in heavily cultural programming, trendy train carriage cafes, boutique shops, and all this kind of, you know, was slightly priced out of the most kind of local person's wants and needs in daily life, and was aspirational towards, you know, this feature. And what a great journey. We've gone from this cultural vanguard to, you know, full-blown gentrification. With most of these houses being unaffordable. And now Deptford's kind of being advertised as 7 minutes away from the city, 9 minutes away from London, and there's nothing to speak about what kind of, you know, fragile intricacies and multiculturalism which exists in the now. And yeah, I think you can kind of see what the local sentiment is for these types of new developments. But I'd say we have allies in this fight, and I'll just share with you 2 examples. This is the Dalston Curve Garden, which was really heavily invested in to make a vibrant green space work. But despite all that investment, it's still falling foul to a regeneration process which doesn't see its innate value. Despite, I think, the fact that they've probably articulated that very well, it's just not being included in the new development scheme. But on the flip side, and I think the guys from Loughborough Junction will talk later, that even from the most precarious of situations with squatted land in the middle of the neighbourhood, if you can convince the right people and put, you know, really appetising proposals forward, you can really state your claim and make long-term improvements from that side of the disempowered community. And to more kind of broader scale aspirational projects, this is Architects for Social Housing, looking at how you can do development on the, you know, much broader scale without having to demolish. You know, that stigmatism of the sink estate can actually be solved through more sensitive approaches which don't displace communities through using infill and other techniques. So yeah, what was our kind of small part to play in this whole process? Last year with Public Works, we collaborated on a project called Trade Deptford, and that was looking at gentrification, identity, and the role of the citizen in Deptford. And I must say at this point there was a lot of lessons to be learned, and I think even being very situated within the community for the last 4 years, I still took the kind of launchpad as being an outsider, being an artist, being different, not being of the lived experience of the major like working class populace in the area. So yeah, I think one lesson we had was just in humility. How do you have to navigate that really sensitive approach to local identity, the confidence to go forward and interact and change place. So we tried a few different techniques around those themes, from cooking shared meals to this mapping exercise, also to listening walks and even theatre. And I'll kind of focus in on this one particular event because I feel this was a real turning point, moving from conflict and actually organising towards more complex ways of resisting this space, and also looking outwards to what we can do to make long-term change which is sustainable. So I think Malik already described what forum theatre is, but we employed 2 practitioners to help us create a narrative story around the idea of gentrification and who this was affecting. So the actors in that play were actually local residents. We made a narrative around the demolition of social housing, the loss of like community space, and who were the kind of bad guys in this. I played a bad guy because I just couldn't get any closer to that, and I explained why this was such a traumatic process for some of the people involved, especially ourselves. So in taking this on as a project, it soon became clear that there was a crisis afoot, and the conflicts weren't really aimed at the developer, the council, who aren't just evil in themselves. That's a really oversimplification of why people feel confused and angry about development as it happens. But actually, a lot of the conflicts were closer to home. They're centered around ourselves as artists, as outsiders, newcomers to an area. Whilst we were still feeling we were sensitive to not overstating our claim to place. And I have to say, unfortunately, Andy had to play a parody of himself as a kind of well-intentioned activist and political agent, but maybe kind of misfiring on the communication and messages we're trying to convey to local audience. But what this kind of did, I feel, was it short-circuited potential crises. It was conflict resolution in the real sense that when the audience saw this play, they get to change the narrative. They take the place of protagonist, and they actually do a better job, infinitely, of what we've done so far. In reality and in this play, this was the kind of hardest thing to come to terms of. You can't escape the fact that you're an actor, and you don't always play a positive role within this situation. And I think what it did was create a real breakthrough, a kind of calling to action point with impassioned speeches and the want to mobilize these disparate groups to work towards higher goals, to more long-term causes. And so our last event was the Deptford Take Back, and I think it really says it all. We're literally here trying to wrestle Deptford back and bring power back to the community and away from that one-sided regeneration process, which just so often doesn't speak for the community or meet its needs. So with the help of Frank and other organisations, we chaired a Deptford Debates, where community leaders and councillors, MPs, were all present to talk about really pressing issues around housing, heritage, community assets, green and open spaces. So I have to bring in here now that there's not just one organisation working. I think where we can say in Deptford there's hundreds of organisations, but some of the ones which were involved in this Housing Action Greenwich and Lewisham, Deptford Debates, Deptford's People's Project, Voice for Deptford, Deptford's, you know, there's so many kind of, you know, replicating work. And I think at this moment in time, there is a neighbourhood forum working on policy towards having a neighbourhood plan for Deptford, looking at, you know, real issues and towards policies like primary residency clauses, assets of community value, and better protection and designation of green space. And this is also a chance for, you know, many diasporas in the community to celebrate and showcase the things they do, which is often, it just can't be achieved when that space isn't available to have that freedom to bring lots of disparate groups together. And yeah, just to quickly go over a project, we thought there's a need here to really articulate what is valuable in these spaces, in green spaces, any public space. And we were trying to do this through an archive in a different way, using citizen science and education and the arts, to just show that this type of plan to demolish a whole mature green space just isn't acceptable. You know, this is a picture of every tree in this garden decimated. The new kind of landscaping plan puts back a few, but there just seems like a real, you know, it's a waste of time and a loss of imagination to have to replicate poorly what's already there. So where did we get to? Well, like I said at the start, this disparate group gathered together to have, you know, real aspirations and demands in their community, and we're really pushing forward ideas to how we want the end result to be. So we went to the town hall to object to the hearing and actually deferred the planning application, which was unprecedented. This hasn't happened in a number of years, certainly not in Lewisham anyway. So this is a huge moment for the community. And I kind of go back to that aspirational image of just showing that development can be different, and what's it like on the ground now. I think there's many groups in Deptford who've come to realise their differences, breaking down assumptions, and including each other in the process to work towards more structural change. They're looking for space. There's a real need now to show that there's learning to be done, information to be disseminated, and I hope that, you know, just from seeing the linkages here today with the previous speakers, that, you know, my question is, can we, you know, make a better format for where all this kind of intellectualism and conceptualizing of the ideas trickle down really to the ground and who's on the ground in the community to make long-lasting and positive change. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Owen. We'd now like to invite the panel to the front, and I'll hand over to Andreas.
Thank you so much. Wow. It felt like 2 hours. So, incredible timekeeping, I have to say. Everyone to the second. So that's as much as my timekeeping goes. We have this weird scenario of the double mic, because one is for the live stream and one is for the amplification. So it's a bit of a weird dance. I hope we'll manage with grace. Maybe before I ask a question, maybe there are already questions from the audience, or maybe there are questions that you have to each other. Yeah, go for it.
Well, it's just, I just thought, maybe not a question, but I thought we could, oh, you want me to hold it? Yeah. Great. I was just really interested in both your talks, that you both raised the notion of aspiration. And there's both like an aspirational politics in the design and in the kind of like that what's next after the sweet spot of becoming a more isolated, cared for kind of middle class space. And then this alternative is also like an aspirational. And so I just wondered, like, in terms of like, traditionally in this country at least, aspiration is quite a conservative notion. Like there's an aspirational class, there's aspirational children, etc. And that's seen as kind of a, yeah, I just wonder where we sit with that, and is there like a politics to try to invent either a new language for like desire, or to to start to shape what alternative aspirations might look like somehow. I don't know.
I think I'm going to do my classic thing of answering and not answering at the same time. So I've been brewing on this a lot, and I think one of the things that I'm currently having a real problem with, and when I call myself a sewer socialist, I actually do, it's not like I haven't invented that as a thing. Like in Milwaukee in the 1930s, the Socialist Party in the United States was really active there, and the party itself would joke that it was full of sewer socialists, and it was because there was a lot of municipalities doing incredibly good work to deliver basic things like sewers, and Milwaukee was really proud that it had this amazing sewer system. And so there is this kind of idea, and actually they were critiqued because as a sort of a way of operating, they didn't attend to the larger, wider structural inequalities, and so there was a sort of a thing of going, well, you're not actually truly socialists because we've got to bring it all down, bring capital down, and so on. And but there was this idea of this absolute faith in local government, and that local government was the sort of locus or the sort of bastion of this idea of a common good, and that we're going to deliver it. And I think I've always believed in that, but I don't think I do anymore. And so my answer to your question would have, in the past, I would have said, well, that's why we need sewer socialists to drive through change and to reconcile and mediate between people's aspirations to make sure that it's even pegged, and that and that's why today I'm very disturbed and distressed, because I don't think I believe in government anymore. And so, yeah, that's what I'm going to say.
Yeah, I mean, I would have to agree. In this case, I think it's like an aspiration born out of necessity, if that means anything, but that it only was there to kind of serve a purpose for disparate groups to organize around, to at least show that this doesn't need to be how it is, And yeah, so what would I say? I think these groups, they're just really not short of ideas. There's just no mechanism by which they can get on a level playing field to realize them. And yeah, the kind of distrust and the disengagement with that process is a real danger. And we have met a lot toe-to-toe with developers and planners, and this is something which is a huge learning curve to myself. And I think maybe Neil's brought it up, is that if there was just a different means by which people were consulted, and the end result would be a more balanced society with better regeneration projects, then we'd all kind of benefit. We wouldn't have to always act aspirationally.
I've been told that we don't actually need the little mic anymore.
We don't need the little mic. Oh God,
Solved.
Spoiling us. Okay, brilliant. I have a question. I mean, this kind of the absence or the lack or loss of trust in government or local government has come through in the first debate as well. And do you think, I guess, that the civic society, since we're discussing the civic, can take its place in a way, or should take its place, or what other structures do we need to demand or invent, or should we put another demand onto the local government? So I'm kind of a bit at a loss still. What is a good tactic going forward, or strategy to on the one hand, we are all accepting that the big society has happened. We don't trust the government anymore, and we're all putting a lot of energy into projects trying to build a replacement. But is that energy in the right place? And are we putting too much